the wrong body, the wrong life. The last thing Morgan Reyes remembered was the smell of instant ramen going cold. She had been sitting at her desk in the apartment she shared with 2 other girls who worked different shifts. She had never actually met them except as evidence: a coffee mug left in the sink, a cardigan draped over the bathroom door, the particular silence of people who came and went like tides. She had been cross-referencing her organic chemistry notes with a lab report due at 8 in the morning, and she had thought, with the distant, half-formed clarity of someone already beginning to slip under, I should eat something. I should sleep. I should. Nothing. Not darkness, exactly. Not the cinematic blackout she might have imagined, if she had ever had the luxury of imagining her own death. Just the absence of the sentence. The thought, unfinished. The ramen, cooling, the cursor blinking on her laptop screen like a small, indifferent heartbeat. And then, fire. Not the burning kind. The light kind. Orange and trembling and close, and the smell of it was all wrong. It was wood smoke layered over something animal and thick. Tallow, maybe. And beneath that, the green cold bite of night air moving through gaps in a structure that was not her apartment. Not any apartment. Not anything she had a reference for in 23 years of careful, exhausted, scholarship-funded life. Morgan opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was low and arched, built from rough-fitted stone sealed with what looked like a pale clay mortar. Animal pelts had been stretched and hung to insulate the walls. A fire burned in a circular pit not 3 feet from where she lay, and the smoke rose through a hole in the ceiling with the lazy confidence of something that had been doing so for years. She sat up. The body moved wrong. That was the first thing. Not the room, not the fire, not the completely inexplicable fact of the stone ceiling. The body moved wrong. She raised her hand toward her face, and a hand came up that had her proportions, but not her skin, not her calluses, not the small burn scar she had earned in her sophomore year, when a Bunsen burner had disagreed with her. These nails were bitten to the quick. These knuckles were fine-boned, and the wrist above them was circled by a bruise in the precise shape of a grip. Someone had held this wrist hard enough to leave a mark. Morgan stared at the bruise for approximately 4 seconds. Then she breathed, slowly, through her nose, the way she had learned to breathe through the particular panic of a failed exam, a missed rent payment, or a professor who handed back her paper with a red C and the margin note insufficient rigor when she had written it at 4 in the morning after a 6-hour shift. Okay, she thought. Catalog. Start with what you can confirm. She was lying on a sleeping pallet, leather-covered and stuffed with something that smelled of dried grass, in a single-room stone dwelling. The fire was her primary light source. There were 2 clay oil lamps on a shelf cut directly into the wall, both unlit. A wooden table. 2 chairs. A large clay pot in the corner, with a wooden lid. Animal pelts were everywhere. Floor, walls, and a heavy one folded at the foot of the pallet that served as a blanket. There was no glass in the narrow window slits. Cold air moved through them freely. Outside, she heard the distant sound of voices, the lowing of something large and hooved, and a child laughing before being shushed. An encampment, large enough to have children and livestock. All right, Morgan thought. All right. The words were a rhythm, not a sentiment. A metronome to keep her functional. She swung her legs off the pallet and nearly fell. The pain in her ribs was sudden and vicious. A bright white-hot line across her left side that made her vision gray at the edges. She caught herself on the edge of the pallet and held very still, breathing through it. When the worst had passed, she pushed her tunic aside. It was rough woven fabric, rust-colored, and beneath it was linen wrapping wound tight. Beneath that, seeping through in a dark stain that was dried at the edges, and still sluggishly fresh at the center, was a wound. She pressed her fingers against it, careful and clinical. Shallow. A knife's work, she thought. She had seen enough chemistry-adjacent anatomy to recognize the angle of a blade entry. It was shallow enough that it had not hit anything vital, yet deep enough that it had bled considerably. The binding was competent but not expertly done, the kind of wound dressing that spoke of practicality rather than medical knowledge. Morgan sat with this information. Someone had stabbed this body. And then the person who had been living in it, the actual owner, the rightful occupant, had died anyway. And whatever she was, whatever had happened to Morgan Reyes in the space between an unfinished thought and this stone room, she had arrived in the window between wounding and death, and apparently, that was enough. She pressed her palm flat against the binding, feeling her own pulse. Alive, she noted. Inventory continues. She found the copper disc on the shelf beside the clay lamps. It was not a mirror. It was a piece of hammered metal, polished to a shine that was more suggestion than reflection, but it was enough. The face that looked back at her was not hers. This was the moment, she thought later, when a different kind of person would have screamed. When the particular horror of it, the wrongness of a strange jaw, a strange mouth, eyes the wrong shade, and a nose she had never seen before, would have broken something fundamental. And she felt it. She was not made of stone. She felt the vertiginous slam of it low in her stomach, the way the floor seemed to tilt. But she had pulled 12-hour shifts on 4 hours of sleep. She had eaten peanut butter from a jar for a week, because it was all she could afford, and she had a midterm. She had lost her mother at 16, and her father before that, and she had stood at a graveside with $40 in her bank account and thought, I have to figure this out. She had always had to figure it out. The face in the copper disc was beautiful. That registered distantly and clinically, the way she might note the purity of a compound. She was fair-skinned in a way that spoke of blood, from somewhere north of wherever this was. Her mouth was full, and a little sullen looking at rest. Her eyes were a gray so pale they were almost silver, heavily lashed. And the hair, she reached up and touched it with the hand that was not hers, confirming, was blonde. Gold, really. It was dark gold at the roots and bright at the ends, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. She had been a brunette. She had had a small nose she had inherited from her mother and a gap between her front teeth, and she had none of this. All right, Morgan said to the copper disc, to herself. All right. She set it back on the shelf. That was when the door opened. She knew, in the single second between the sound of the latch and the appearance of the man filling the doorframe, that she should probably be sitting down. She should look appropriately fragile. The body she was in had a recent stab wound, and had apparently spent the past several hours unconscious. She had exactly zero understanding of the social architecture of this place, what was expected of her, or even who this person was. Then she saw him, and she forgot to calculate. He was. Large was the wrong word. Large implied bulk without direction. He had the kind of size that had a quality to it, the kind that came from a life lived hard and physical and in the open. He was wide through the shoulder and lean through everything else, all of it wrapped in dark clothing that might once have been fine, but had been repaired too many times to make that argument anymore. His hair was black, the kind of black that had no undertone, pulled back and tied at the base of his neck. His skin was brown and weathered, and crossed at the jaw with a scar that was old enough to be silver white, thin and precise. The kind that healed that cleanly, only when it was cared for. He was not conventionally handsome. He was something more uncomfortable than that. The kind of face that demanded to be looked at and resented you for looking. All severe angles and a mouth set in a line that suggested it had not softened in recent memory. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were very dark. Not warm dark. They were the kind of dark that was the absence of light, rather than the presence of something else. He was also leaning slightly to his left, compensating for his right side. She could see, with the detached attention she had learned cataloging data, that his right boot had been modified, the sole built up differently, and that the lean was not a casual habit. It was structural. It was permanent. He looked at her the way she imagined a man looked at a storm he had already decided he could not outrun, not afraid, not welcoming, simply measuring the damage. You're awake, he said. His voice was low and rough, with a cadence she half understood and half received through some echo of the body she was wearing. The original woman's language memory sat inside her mind like a second set of subtitles, slightly out of sync. I am, Morgan said. Something crossed his face, quick as weather. He moved into the room, and she tracked the way he moved, how he carried the limp not with shame, but with a kind of deliberate refusal to accommodate it, as if he had decided some time ago that his body's limitations would not alter the way he took up space. He went to the fire and crouched beside it, checking something in the small clay pot nested in the coals. The shadows caught the scar on his jaw and the line of his profile, and she thought, with the completely inconvenient corner of her brain that had minored in literature before practicality won, he looks like someone who was made for a different, crueler world, and arrived in this one anyway. You were unconscious for 2 days, he said, without looking at her. The wound woman said you would either wake or you wouldn't. A pause. The briefest one. You woke. He said it as if it were a minor administrative update. Yes, Morgan said. I did. There's broth. He nodded toward the pot. You'll drink it. Not would you like. Not are you hungry. It was the flat, declarative grammar of a man who phrased things as logistics because the alternative, caring about the answer, was a vulnerability he had already priced and declined. Morgan looked at the pot. She realized, ravenously hungry in the specific way of a body that had burned through its resources and was now running on fumes. The smell of whatever was in that clay pot was not good exactly, but it was warm, and it was animal protein. She had eaten worse things for worse reasons. Thank you, she said. He did look at her then, just briefly. It was as if she had said something in a language he recognized from a long time ago. He stood, poured the broth into a clay cup, and set it on the table. He did not bring it to her. He set it there, and stepped back, as if proximity required more trust than he was extending tonight. Morgan stood up, held her ribs together with one arm, and crossed to the table. She sat. She drank. It tasted of marrow and something herbed, and it was the best thing she had consumed since a gas station sandwich 6 months ago that she had eaten sitting on a curb outside her second shift because she did not have time to go home. He watched her drink it with the careful, unreadable attention of a man conducting an assessment he had not announced. The totem ceremony, he said, is in 3 days. You will stand beside me. Morgan lowered the cup. What's the totem ceremony? The silence that followed was very specific. It was the silence of a man recalibrating. You know what it is, he said. Humor me, Morgan said. Then, because the edge in his expression sharpened, I hit my head. When I fell, she did not know if the original woman had hit her head. She was inventing scaffolding in real time. Some things are unclear. He studied her. She held his gaze steadily and tried to look like a woman with a head injury rather than a chemistry student who had recently died and colonized someone else's life. The ceremony presents bonded pairs to the ancestors, he said slowly, as if he were translating down to a simpler register. It is a formal acknowledgement before the tribe and the elders. Marriages unrecognized by the totem are, a pause, considered informal. Easily dissolved. Ah! So this was about legitimacy. She was looking at a man who needed her publicly present and publicly credible, or their marriage, whatever it meant in the architecture of this place, would be considered nothing. And if I don't stand beside you? She asked. Then you are not my wife, he said, very flat. And this dwelling is not your dwelling, and whatever arrangements brought you here cease to apply. She would be a foreign woman alone in an encampment with a stab wound and no resources. The calculus was not complicated. I'll stand beside you, Morgan said. You'll do more than stand, he said. You will not embarrass this household. And there it was. The first real thing, the thing beneath the logistics. He was braced for it. He expected her to embarrass him. He had built that expectation into the sentence like load-bearing architecture. Morgan thought of the copper disc, of the face she now wore, of the bruise on her wrist and the knife wound in her ribs, and the fact that the woman who had lived here before her had been purchased from a brothel and married as a transaction by a man the tribe had decided did not matter anymore. I'll do my best, she said mildly. Your best, he repeated, as if the phrase were in a foreign dialect. I don't have another gear, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not softening. He did not seem built for softening. It was more like the adjustment of a man who was pushed against a wall expecting it to give and found it unexpectedly solid. He looked at her for one more moment, dark eyes moving across her face with the deliberate attention of someone reading a document in a language he was mostly fluent in. My name is Jax, he said. It was not an offering. It was information, delivered the way he delivered everything, as logistics. Son of Voran, you are in the eastern dwelling of the Vorrkai encampment. My holding. A pause. You will not attempt to leave. I wasn't planning to, Morgan said, which was true. She had nowhere to go. He held her gaze for one moment more. Then he moved toward the door. Jax, she said. He stopped. He did not turn fully, just angled slightly, the scar on his jaw catching the firelight. My name is Morgan, she said. I thought you should know. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the encampment made its living sounds, voices, animals, the distant ring of metal on metal. I know your name, he said. Then you know more than I've been given credit for, she said very quietly. Almost to herself. He left. Morgan sat with the empty clay cup and the dying fire and the body she was borrowing. She listened to his footsteps, uneven, deliberate, refusing to be hurried, until they faded into the ambient noise of a world she had never been told she would need to navigate. She thought about her lab report. She thought about the ramen. She thought about the particular exhaustion of a life lived entirely in survival mode, problem to problem, shift to shift, and how it had ended not with anything earned or anything finished, but with a cursor blinking on an empty screen. And she thought about the way he had looked at her. It was not with desire. Nothing was so simple. It was with a wariness that had the texture of something that had once been hope, and had been educated out of it. She recognized that. She had worn it herself, in mirrors that actually reflected her. She set the cup down. All right, she said to the stone ceiling and the guttering fire, and whatever remained of the woman whose body she now wore like borrowed clothing. All right. Let's figure this out. She pulled the clay pot closer and found the last of the broth still warm at the bottom. She drank it because she was a practical woman, and the body needed fuel, and she began, methodically, to take inventory of everything she knew. She was a chemistry senior who had been 23 years old and knew the molecular composition of soap, the rendering process for tallow candles, the basic principles of fermentation and distillation, and what plants were likely to have antibacterial properties. She had a stab wound, a foreign language approximated through a dead woman's memory, and a husband who trusted her precisely as much as he trusted anyone, which appeared to be not at all. She had, she thought, worked with less. Outside, the encampment settled into its night sounds. Somewhere in the dark she could hear him, not his footsteps anymore, but his voice, low and clipped, speaking to someone near the door. Guarding, maybe. Or just unable to sleep. She pulled the heavy pelt blanket around herself and lay back on the pallet that smelled of someone else's life. She stared at the ceiling and thought, he has a spine like a man who has been broken in a specific place and healed crooked and decided that was fine. She thought, he didn't ask me if I was in pain. She thought, neither did I. She closed her eyes, somewhere in the moments before she slept, not peace, not safety, just the body finally overriding the mind and demanding its due. She thought she heard him say something outside. Quiet. 2 syllables. Her name, maybe. She could not be sure. Constraints. Chapter 2. What her hands know. She woke before dawn, because her body had always woken before dawn. 3 jobs had cured her of the luxury of sleeping through anything. The early morning cleaning shift at the university gym started at 5, which meant her alarm had been set for 4:15 for so long that the habit had calcified into something biological. A twitch behind the eyes, a restlessness in the limbs, the particular alertness of a body trained to expect demand before the world was properly light. This world was not properly light. The fire in the pit had burned down to coals, orange-red and breathing slowly, and the window slits were still dark. Morgan lay still for exactly 30 seconds, cataloging herself the way she had the night before: wound, body, room, situation, and then she sat up, held her ribs, and got to work. She found a clay basin near the large pot in the corner, and a smaller vessel of water beside it. She washed her face and hands, careful and thorough, noting the other contents of the dwelling she had been too exhausted to inventory the night before. There was a wooden chest against the far wall, iron-latched. A row of hooks near the door held 2 heavy cloaks, one broad-shouldered and dark, one smaller and rust-colored, that matched the tunic she was wearing. Dried bundles of something herbed hung from a ceiling beam. A knife sat on the table in a worn leather sheath. She looked at the knife for a moment, then she looked away. Not because she was afraid of it, but because picking up a knife in a strange place on day 2 of inhabiting someone else's life seemed like precisely the kind of decision that foreclosed other options. She found the food stores in the large clay pot: dried meat, hard cheese, a coarse grain she did not recognize, and dried berries that were nearly black. She took a small portion of everything and ate standing up, looking out through one of the narrow window slits at the encampment beginning to wake outside. It was larger than she had estimated by sound alone. The dwelling spread in a rough arc around a central open area where the fire pits were already being stoked, women moving between them with the efficient, unself-conscious purpose of people performing tasks they had done 10,000 times. Beyond the dwellings, she could see enclosure walls, animal pens, and beyond those, at the edge of her sightline, the beginning of a tree line that was dark and dense and enormous. It was not a forest, she recognized. It was not a continent, she recognized. The trees were wrong. Too tall, the canopy too dense, the color of the trunks a deep reddish-brown she had no reference for. The sky above them, beginning to lighten, was doing something she had never seen a sky do. It was turning a pale violet gold rather than the usual pink-orange, as if the light source was slightly off, slightly different, slightly other. Morgan pressed her fingers against the stone sill of the window and breathed. Different planet, she thought, with the flat calm of a woman who had already spent her allotted panic on the face and the copper disc. Or different world. Or something else entirely. Table it. It doesn't change the immediate variables. The immediate variables were a healing stab wound, a husband who trusted her like he trusted open ground after a storm, a public ceremony in 3 days she needed to survive with credibility, and no resources beyond what existed in this room, and whatever her own mind could manufacture from available materials. She turned away from the window. Her eyes went to the ash in the fire pit. She worked out the logistics while Jax was gone. He had not been in the dwelling when she woke. She did not know when he had left or where he went, and she had approximately 0 intelligence about his daily schedule, but the cloak was missing from its hook, and she could extrapolate. Warrior, disgraced but not discharged, which meant duties he still performed whether the tribe valued them or not. She suspected he was the kind of man who showed up whether anyone was watching. She had 2 hours, maybe 3. She found what she needed in the dwelling, and what she could not find, she located outside, moving carefully among the communal areas with her ribs wrapped tight, and her face arranged in an expression she had perfected over years of service jobs: present, pleasant, asking no one for anything, drawing no attention. She found a clay pot no one was using near the ash heap behind the communal fire. She found fat, tallow, rendered and stored in a sealed clay jar near the food storage area, and she took a small portion, not enough to be noticed. She collected ash from the fire pit in the dwelling. Soap. She was going to make soap. It was not, on the surface, the most dramatic opening move. She was aware of this. She was not laboring under the illusion that a batch of lye soap would transform the political landscape of the Vorrkai encampment, or solve the problem of being a foreign woman with a stab wound. But soap was something she could make, with ash and fat and water and time, and she needed to make something, needed to feel her hands doing work she understood, needed the specific steadiness that came from a process with known inputs and predictable outputs. Chemistry had always done that for her. The world was chaos, but a chemical reaction was honest. It did what it did based on what it was. No performance required. She built the fire back up and started the lye water first, layering ash in the clay pot with water and letting it leach. While she waited, she began exploring the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling beam, rubbing small amounts between her fingers and smelling them, cross-referencing with the borrowed ghost memory of the body she was wearing. Lavender, or something like it. A sharp green herb she did not fully recognize. Something astringent that might be useful for the wound on her ribs, if she could confirm it would not cause a reaction. She was deep into this process. The lye water leaching, the tallow warming in a secondary pot, her fingers stained green from the astringent herb when the door opened. She had been listening for the uneven footfall. She heard it. "You're up," Jack said from the doorway. "I've been up for hours," Morgan said without turning around. A pause. She could feel him reading the room. The fire rebuilt, the pots arranged, the herbs sorted into small piles on the table, the smell of wood smoke and something chemical beginning to overlay the usual smoky fat smell of the dwelling. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making soap." Another pause. Longer. "You're injured," he said. "I'm aware." She adjusted her grip on the stirring paddle she had fashioned from a smooth piece of wood she had found near the ash heap. "The wound is shallow. Movement is fine." The wound woman said rest. "The wound woman," Morgan said carefully, "has not met me." She heard him come into the room. He stopped somewhere behind her, close enough that she could sense the particular quality of his presence. He was significant, the way a large and dangerous thing was always significant, even when it was being perfectly still. She kept her eyes on the lye water. "This is your second day here," he said. "In this dwelling, yes. And you are making soap." "I am making soap." "Why?" She did turn around then. He was standing with his arms crossed and his dark eyes moving between her and the arrangement of pots and herbs, with an expression that was not quite suspicion, and not quite curiosity. It lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. "Because we need it," she said simply. "And because I know how." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. It seemed to be his resting state, and the scar caught the firelight. She noticed, in the honest accounting of a woman trying to assess her situation, that he was the kind of physically arresting that made it difficult to think in straight lines if she let herself look too long. She did not let herself look too long. "We have soap," he said. "You have a rendered fat block that someone rubbed ash into," Morgan said. "That's not quite the same thing." Something moved in his expression. The corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not even close, but the ghost of the musculature involved in one twitched. "Leave the fire," he said, moving toward the table. "Eat something, then do whatever this is." It was not, she noted, a "do not do this." It was a "do it after you have eaten." She catalogued the distinction. She ate. He sat across the table with his elbows on the wood and ate his own food. They did not speak, which should have been uncomfortable, and was instead simply quiet. She had spent enough of her life in shared silences, apartments with strangers, break rooms at work, libraries at 3 a.m, to know the difference between a silence that was hostile and one that was just two people in proximity who had not yet agreed on what to say. This was the second kind. Barely. But still. The woman's name was Sarah. She appeared at the edge of the dwelling's open door mid-morning, when Jax had gone and Morgan was carefully cutting the first cooled batch of soap into rough blocks. She was older, broad through the shoulders, with the worn, appraising look of someone who had seen most things and developed opinions about all of them. She was carrying a clay water vessel that was obviously a pretext. "You're the foreign wife," Sarah said. "I am," Morgan said. Sarah's eyes moved to the soap. "What's that?" "Soap." Morgan picked up a block and held it out. "Real soap. Lye rendered. Try it." Sarah looked at the block the way she might look at an unexpected animal. Then she took it, turned it over, smelled it, and rubbed a corner between her fingers. Her eyes changed slightly. "It lathers," she said. "Thoroughly," Morgan confirmed. "And it keeps. A block that size will last a household 2 weeks, with daily use." Sarah looked at her. Looked at the soap, looked at her again. "What do you want for it?" she said. "Nothing," Morgan said. "Consider it a greeting." Sarah left with the soap and returned an hour later with a woman named Bree, who was younger and more openly curious. Bree left with a block of soap and returned the following morning with her sister. By the end of the second day, Morgan had distributed 6 blocks and acquired, without asking for any of it, a larger clay pot, 2 good handfuls of a specific dried herb she had been trying to locate, a second pair of hide sandals that fit better than the original pair, and a quantity of social intelligence she quietly filed away. She learned from Sarah that Jax was the dead chief's second son, and the dead chief's clear favorite, and that everyone knew it, and that Draven knew it most acutely of all. She learned from Bree that the injury had happened 14 months ago. Before it, Jax had been considered one of the 3 finest warriors in the Vorrkai, and had led the eastern border patrols personally. After it, Draven had wasted no time reassigning those duties to his own men. She learned from Bree's sister that the original woman had been very quiet and very frightened, and had cried sometimes at night, and that Jax had not been unkind to her but had also not seemed to know what to do with a person who required comfort. Morgan filed all of this carefully. She made candles on the 3rd morning. The tallow rendering was cleaner than the first batch because she had sorted out a better heat gradient. The wicks she had braided from plant fiber burned steadily and gave off considerably less smoke than the rushes that had been the primary light source. She set them in clay holders along the shelf and lit them at dusk. The room changed. It became, in the specific way that adequate light changes spaces, somewhere a person could actually be rather than just exist. Jax came in from the dark outside and stopped. She watched him take it in. The lit candles. The room. He stood in the doorway with his cloak still on, and the cold air coming in around him. His face did the thing it did when she surprised him. That quick recalculation. There and gone. Candles, he said. Tallow rendered clean, she said. Better wick. Less smoke. He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the door and took his cloak off and hung it on the hook. The deliberateness of the ordinary gesture, the choosing to stay, to be inside rather than outside, felt like something she should not look at directly. You made these, he said. The materials were here. She shrugged. I knew the process. He looked at her across the room with the candlelight doing something unfair to the planes of his face. The scar silver gold. The dark eyes warmer in this light than they seemed in daylight. Or perhaps she was imagining that. Perhaps warmth was something she was projecting, because she was a person who had been very cold for a long time, and she was in a room that was, for the first time, actually lit. Where did you learn these things, he said. It was not quite a question. I always liked knowing how things worked, Morgan said, which was true and sufficiently vague. How to make things from available materials. I found it, she paused, selecting, useful. Where I came from, and where did you come from, he said, and his voice had a different quality now. Not the logistics voice. Something that cost more. She met his gaze. Somewhere very far from here, she said honestly. Somewhere I'm not going back to. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she held his. The candles between them threw small, steady flames that did not waver, because she had built the wicks right. She had always built things right when she had the materials to work with. The ceremony is tomorrow, he said. I know. You understand what they'll say. About you? About us, he said, with a flatness that carried everything it was refusing to carry. The history of it, the specific humiliation of being a man whose worth had been publicly decided by the way his foot hit the ground. We are not what the tribe values. I have made no secret of the circumstances of this marriage. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her to expect it. He was, in his particular way, trying to prepare her, which she realized was as close to consideration as he was currently capable of. She found it, against her better judgment, quite affecting. I grew up with very little, Morgan said carefully. People who have very little are always being assessed by people who have more. I learned to conduct myself in rooms that did not want me in them. She paused. I'll be fine. His jaw did something, not the tightening, the opposite, a fraction of release. You're strange, he said. It was not an insult, it was genuinely puzzled, the observation of a man who had been expecting a known variable and kept getting something else. Very probably, Morgan agreed. He almost smiled. She was 90% sure of it, the almost of it. The arrested movement of a face that had simply gotten out of the habit and did not quite complete the motion. Then he moved to his side of the room and began removing his weapons in the methodical way she was starting to recognize as his evening ritual. 2 knives unstrapped from his thigh, a larger blade from his back, all of it laid out in a specific order on the wooden chest. She turned back to the herb she was sorting and did not watch him. She was very conscious of not watching him, which was its own kind of watching. Jax, she said to the dried herbs. What? The patrol rotations the night you were injured. She kept her voice neutral. Scientific. Were they your original assignments or had they been changed? The silence was very long. Why? He said, and his voice had gone to a place she had not heard yet. Quiet and bottomless and careful, the voice of a man who had learned that certain questions came attached to certain intentions and was determining which kind this was. I'm trying to understand the encampment, she said. How things are organized. How decisions are made. Another silence. Then. They had been changed. The night before. Who changed them? The order came from the chief's administration. Draven. She did not say it. She just filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the information she was not done with yet, next to the soap formula, and the candle measurements, and the specific bruise on the wrist of the woman who had been here before her. "Thank you," she said. "You're not what I expected," he said from across the room. She looked up. He was watching her with his weapons laid out beside him, and the candlelight she had made between them, and an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face so far. It was still not very unguarded, but it was something. "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to apply to most things. Then, "Less," he said simply. Morgan looked at him in the warm light of the candle she had built from available materials in a world she had not asked to arrive in, and she thought, so did everyone. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a ceremony tomorrow." She blew out 2 of the candles to save the tallow. She left one burning, small and steady, between their sides of the room. And if she lay awake for a long time in the dark afterward, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, if she noted, with the careful attention of a scientist who knew better than to ignore data, that the sound of him present and breathing in the same room made her feel, against all reason, slightly less alone, she kept that information to herself. She had always been good at that. The morning of the ceremony, Morgan woke to find a dress laid across the foot of her pallet. It was not the rust-colored tunic, nor anything she had seen in the wooden chest or on the hooks by the door. This was different. Deep green, the color of the tree line at dusk, made from a fabric that was finer than anything else in the dwelling. It was soft in the way of something that had been worked, until the fibers gave up their roughness. There was leather lacing at the bodice, dark brown, and at the hem was a border of small stitched symbols she did not have the cultural vocabulary to read yet, but she recognized them as intentional. Meaningful. She sat up and touched it. Jax was already gone. His weapons were missing from the chest. But the dress was here, laid out with a precision that was entirely him. No flourish, no note, just the object itself placed where she would find it. The gesture was stripped of everything decorative and left as pure function. "You will need this," that was what it said. Not, "I thought of you," not anything soft. And yet, Morgan dressed carefully, working around the wound dressing. When she stood before the copper disc, she was briefly and completely unprepared for what looked back. The green made the pale gray of her borrowed eyes look almost luminous. The bodice lacing, cinched properly, did something architectural to the body she was wearing. A body that was, she had been trying not to notice, built along lines that were frankly unreasonable. The woman before her in the copper blur was tall and gold-haired, possessed of the kind of beauty that had a physical weight to it. The kind that preceded a person into a room and changed the temperature. Morgan had spent 23 years in a body that was fine. Serviceable. She had not thought about it much because she had not had time, and also because thinking about it led nowhere useful. She was unprepared for this, for the specific disorientation of looking at a face that was beautiful, the way a chemical reaction was beautiful, complete, precise, everything in its correct proportion. She turned away from the copper disc before she could think about it any further. He was waiting outside. He had done something with his appearance that amounted, for Jax, to ceremony. The dark clothing was newer, or at least the least repaired version of what she had seen. His black hair was pulled back cleanly, and there were 2 narrow braids at his temple that she had not seen before, tight and deliberate. She would learn later these were warriors' braids, signifying lineage and battle right. He was armed. Of course he was armed. She suspected he slept armed. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something happened in his face that he controlled almost immediately. Almost, but she caught the half-second before the control landed. She filed that unguarded flash away with the other things she was not done thinking about. "The dress fits," he said. "It does," she said. "Thank you." He looked away. "It was practical," he said. "You couldn't stand at the totem in a working tunic." "Of course," Morgan said, keeping her voice entirely neutral. She did not smile. They walked to the totem ground together, and she matched his pace without thinking about it. She did not slow artificially or pull ahead. She simply adjusted, the way she had always adjusted to the physical rhythm of her environment. She felt him notice. The not accommodating the limp for him, she felt the fractional shift in his bearing beside her, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite pride, but lived near both. The encampment was already gathered. The totem poles were extraordinary. She had not seen them yet. They stood on the far side of the central fireground, 3 of them, each easily 4 times her height, carved from the reddish-brown trunks of the massive trees she had seen at the forest edge. The carvings covered every surface, figures, animals, and geometric forms that interlocked with a mathematical complexity that made her fingers itch with the desire to map them. She looked at them and thought, involuntarily, These people are not primitive. These people are deep. The tribe was arranged in a rough arc around the totem ground. Several hundred people, she estimated, ranging from elders seated on carved wooden platforms to children held at the back by older siblings. Everyone was looking at them, mostly. She felt the gaze the way she had always felt unwanted assessment, as a kind of pressure distributed across the skin. She heard, in the body memory of the woman she was wearing, the instinct to make herself smaller. To fold. She overrode it with the same quiet decisiveness she had used on the ramen and the copper disc. She stood straight. She kept her chin level. She put her hand in the crook of Jax's arm. He went very still at the contact, a controlled stillness like a large animal surprised into motionlessness. And she walked with him toward the totems, like a woman who had arrived exactly where she intended. The murmuring started low and spread. She caught fragments through the body memory translation. Foreign woman, brothel bot, his bastard wife. Look at her. Look at him, limping to his own ceremony. Jax's arm under her hand had gone to iron. She pressed her fingers slightly against it. Not much. Just enough to say, I hear it too. Keep walking. He kept walking. Draven was standing at the front of the assembled elders, and Morgan understood him in the first 3 seconds of looking at him. He was handsome in a way that was designed to be useful, symmetrical, well-groomed, with an easy physical confidence that read as authority to people who confused performance with substance. He wore the chief's furs with the comfort of a man who had spent years deciding he deserved them. His eyes, when they found her across the totem ground, were dark, pleasant, and completely calculating. He smiled at her. She smiled back and put everything she had into making it warm. Know your opponent, she thought, before they know you. The ceremony was conducted by an elder woman, small, ancient, and carrying a staff carved with the same interlocking figures as the totem poles. She spoke in a formal register that pushed the limits of Morgan's comprehension. She caught the structure, a calling of names, an invocation of ancestors, a formal question put to the assembled tribe. She watched the people around her for cues and mirrored the responses. Jax beside her was a controlled, impenetrable presence. She could feel the tension in him without looking, the held straight spine, the deliberate weight on both feet despite what it cost his right side, the jaw that could have been carved from the same wood as the totems. He was enduring this. Every second of it. She understood, with a sudden and unexpected clarity, that he had never had anyone stand beside him. Not like this. Not by choice. Then, Draven stepped forward. A moment, he said to the elder woman with a deferential incline of his head that was perfectly judged, respectful enough not to give offense, authoritative enough to command the pause. He turned to address the tribe with the ease of a man who loved the sound of his own voice. We celebrate all bonds before the totem, he said warmly. Even those made in, a pause that lasted exactly long enough. Unconventional circumstances. My brother has always chosen his own path. His eyes moved to Jax with an expression of fond, sorrowful affection that was so precisely calibrated it was almost impressive. We can only hope that this union brings him the comfort his, another pause. Current limitations prevent him from finding elsewhere. Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. The kind that moved through a crowd when permission had been given. Morgan felt Jax go absolutely still beside her. She stepped forward. It was not a large step. It was not dramatic. It was simply the step of a woman repositioning herself to be seen, and she took it with the absolute calm of someone who had once talked a university financial aid officer out of canceling her scholarship by being the most reasonable person in the room. Chief Draven, she said, her voice carrying clear and unhurried. The laughter stopped. Draven looked at her with polite attention and something cooler behind it. I'm grateful, she said, for your welcome. I've heard a great deal about your generosity toward your brother, and I'm glad to see it demonstrated so publicly. She kept her tone warm and her expression open. It speaks well of your character that you mark his household ceremony with your personal attention. Many chiefs would leave such ceremonies to the elders alone. A pause. And I must say, she continued, her eyes moving briefly across the assembled tribe before returning to Draven with perfect pleasantness, that the people of the Vorrkai are fortunate to have a chief so invested in the contentment of his brother's wife. It suggests a generosity of spirit that I'm certain the tribe has come to depend upon. Silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The specific, compressed silence of a crowd that has just watched something happen and is deciding how to receive it. She had given them nothing to object to. Every word was technically a compliment, yet the blade in it was audible to anyone paying attention. The crowd paid attention. Somewhere at the back, someone made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was quickly suppressed. Draven's pleasant expression held for exactly 1 beat too long. Then he inclined his head, graciously, and stepped back. Morgan returned to Jax's side. He said nothing. His arm under her hand had changed. Still tense, but differently. It was no longer the held rigid tension of a man bracing for impact. The elder woman resumed the ceremony. Afterward, walking back through the encampment, Jax was quiet for so long she thought he was not going to speak at all. That, he said finally, was dangerous. I know, Morgan said. You made an enemy. He was already an enemy, she said. I just let him know I'd noticed. Jax stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen yet. Not the recalculation, but something raw. It was there and gone like his not quite smile. But she caught it. The woman I married, he said slowly, did not speak in public. No, Morgan said. I know. She didn't look anyone in the eye. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was long and amber, and the sounds of the tribe were distant. They were standing closer than they usually stood, because the path was narrow, and neither had adjusted. You're not her, he said. It was not an accusation. It was the conclusion of someone who had been assembling evidence. Morgan held his gaze. No, she said. I'm not. Then who are you? Someone who ended up here, she said, and decided to make it work. He looked at her for a long moment in the amber light, and she looked back. The distance between them was the space where decisions had not yet been made. Your ribs, he said abruptly. Still attached, she said. You were standing for 2 hours. I've stood longer. She paused. I used to work an 8-hour shift before sitting a 4-hour exam. He did not understand the reference, but he understood the meaning. His jaw did the not quite release again. Come, he said, turning toward the dwelling. She followed. Inside, the candles were lit, and the fire rebuilt. The ordinary architecture of the space was beginning to feel less foreign. She sat on the edge of the pallet to unwrap and rewrap her ribs. The binding had shifted during the ceremony, and the ache was persistent. She was working at the outer layers, her fingers efficient, when she became aware that Jax had not moved to his side of the room. She looked up. He was standing a few feet away, watching her work at the bandaging. His eyes moved from her hands to her face and back. She understood, with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had been carefully not noticing things, that his difficulty was not entirely about the wound, the dress, the candlelight, the fact that she was sitting on the edge of the pallet, unwrapping the lacing at her side. She was aware of what she looked like in this body. I can do it, she said. Steady. You can't reach the back binding, he said. His voice had dropped. It was not intentional, which made it more interesting. She considered this, then she turned, presenting her back to him, and moved her hair over one shoulder. He crossed to her. She felt the pallet dip very slightly as he sat on the edge of it behind her. Not pressed against her, but present, in the way his size was always present. His hands found the knot at the center of her back. They were careful hands. She had not expected that. They were large and scarred, capable of the violence his weapon suggested, yet they were careful, untying the knot with a deliberateness that told her something he would never have said. He was choosing to be careful. The binding loosened. She breathed. His hands paused at her back, just, present. The wound is healing, she said, because the silence was doing something to the temperature of the room. Yes, he said. His voice was very low. She turned her head slightly, enough to see the line of his jaw and the black of his hair. Jax, she said. What? Thank you. For the dress. A pause. His hands had not moved from the loose bandaging, neither pressing nor retreating. It was practical, he said again, but this time it landed differently. The repetition exposed the seam. She could hear the thing beneath the practicality, the thing he kept covering with logistics. She turned to face him. They were close. 2 days of accumulated restraint were compressed into the specific nearness of two people who were now looking with their eyes. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the candles the first night, like something he had no category for yet. She could see, up close, that his eyes were not fully black. They were very dark brown, warm and almost amber at the edges. She had not noticed that before. You should sleep, he said. His voice was doing the low thing again. I should rewrap the binding first, she said. I'll do it, he said. His hands were already moving, competent and careful. He worked with a focus that had to stay practical. His fingers brushed her ribs, the uninjured side, and it was nothing, just incidental contact. Her breath changed anyway. She felt him feel it change. His hands stilled for just 1 second before they finished the knot. He sat back. They were both looking at the fire. You handled yourself well today, he said after a long moment. So did you, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the closest thing to one she had heard. Low and brief and reluctant. There, she thought, identifying the compound. There you are. Draven will move against us, he said. He had said us. I know, she said. He doesn't lose quietly. Neither do I, she said. He turned and looked at her fully. No assessment, no recalculation. Just the looking. And she looked back. The fire between them was the fire she had built, and the candles were the candles she had made. Sleep, he said quietly. Almost gentle. She lay down on the pallet. He stayed at the edge for a long time before moving to his own side. She listened to him settle, the small adjustments of a large body, the particular care he took with his right foot. "Jax," she said to the dark. "What?" he said. "The ceremony. We did well." A silence that had weight. "Yes," he said. "We did." She closed her eyes. The single candle burned down to almost nothing before it went out. In the last of its light, she could see the line of him, the broad shoulder, the still profile, the deliberate presence of a man who had decided to stay. She did not need to look. She knew he was there. The battle lines are drawn. Chapter 4. What the Fire Knows. 3 weeks changed things. Not dramatically. Not in the ways that songs were made about, or that elders recounted at fire ceremonies with their hands wide and their voices full. It happened quietly. The way water changed stone, the same water, the same stone, day after day, until one morning the edge was different, and you couldn't say exactly when it had gone. Morgan had stopped thinking of the dwelling as a place she was surviving, and started thinking of it as a place she was building. There was a difference. She felt it in the way she moved through it, the specific ownership of someone who had arranged a space to her own logic, who knew where everything was because she had put it there. The herbs hung in a different order now, sorted by application rather than size. The fire was maintained at a more consistent temperature, because she'd figured out the draft pattern of the ceiling hole, and adjusted the surrounding stone ring accordingly. The soap production had expanded into a small but real operation. She was rendering and cutting 12 blocks a week, trading 10 of them through the network that Sarah anchored and keeping 2 for the household. The household's stores had changed. More food. Better quality. Last week, a man named Corvin, one of the senior hunters, had appeared at the door with a haunch of something large and dark-meated that turned out to be excellent, in exchange for 2 blocks of soap and the salve she'd developed for his wife's persistent joint pain. He had addressed Jax when he arrived, and Jax when he left, the formal courtesy of men doing business. But his eyes had gone to Morgan each time with a respect that was new and specific. She was being assessed. She was passing. Jax watched all of it with the careful, ongoing attention of a man updating a map in real time, revising the terrain as new information arrived, precise and without sentiment. He didn't comment on the trades. He didn't tell her what to do with the resources she accumulated. He also didn't ask her to stop, which she understood was its own kind of permission from a man who gave permission by not withholding it. What he did do. He told her things. Not much. Not freely. In the specific, rationed way of someone who had learned that information given was a vulnerability incurred, a piece at a time, like paying out rope, keeping hold of the end. He told her the names of the senior council elders and which ones were genuinely neutral, and which ones performed neutrality while feeding information to Draven's household. He told her the significance of the totem carvings she'd been cataloging, each figure a lineage marker, each animal an ancestral attribute, the geometric borders indicating alliance bonds between families. He told her, one evening without preamble, that his father had stood him before the totem alone when he was 8 years old, and named him in the warrior lineage despite the bastard blood, which was not done, and which Draven had never forgiven. She listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, filing, making connections he didn't know she was making, and she gave him things in return. Small things, observations about the encampment's resource patterns, the informal social hierarchies she'd mapped through the soap network, the particular relationships between certain elder wives and their council seat husbands. She gave him the information without making it a transaction, just, "Here is a thing I noticed. It seemed relevant to you," and he received it without acknowledging that he was receiving it, which was fine. She understood that language. What she did not give him, herself, not yet. Not because she wasn't aware of the pull of it, she was a scientist, she cataloged data honestly, and the data was unambiguous. She was aware of him in the specific, inconvenient way that had nothing to do with safety calculations or resource logistics. The way he moved through the dwelling in the mornings, quiet and already fully present in the day when she was still assembling herself over the first cup of whatever passed for tea. The way he handled his weapons in the evening, the unhurried, intimate familiarity of it, the knives laid out in their order, the larger blade checked and wrapped, his hands moving through the routine with a focus that had a quality of meditation to it. The way he had, without discussion, begun leaving the single candle burning when he went out before dawn, on the morning she was still asleep, so she wouldn't wake to dark. She was aware of all of it. She kept it in the category of things I am not acting on, and worked to keep the category sealed. The wound was what unsealed it. It had been healing well. She had been meticulous about the dressing, about keeping the astringent herb compress applied consistently, and the skin was knitting cleanly without the heat or smell that would have signaled infection. But 3 weeks in, something shifted. A deeper ache than the surface healing. A specific soreness that she recognized as the muscle beneath the wound, which had been held rigid to protect the injury and had developed its own complaint. She had been ignoring it during the day. At night she had been sleeping carefully on her uninjured side, and had not made noise about it, Because making noise about pain was something she had trained out of herself at 16, when there had been no one to make noise to. Jax found out the way Jax found out most things, by watching. She had reached for the water vessel on the high shelf, the one she kept moving up there because the alternative arrangement she'd tried kept getting in the way of the herb sorting, and the reach had pulled the muscle wrong, and she had made a sound. Involuntary, small, quickly suppressed, but he was in the room, and he heard it. He crossed to her in 4 steps. Not hurried, deliberate, the focused movement of a man who had located a problem and was addressing it. "Show me," he said. "It's fine," she said, which was mostly true. Morgan. Her name in his mouth was still new enough to do something to her attention every time. He didn't use it often. When he did, it had a weight that she suspected he didn't fully intend and couldn't fully hide. "It's the muscle under the wound," she said. "It's been held too tight. It's not serious." "I know what serious looks like." "Show me anyway," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned and lifted the hem of the tunic to expose the binding. He unwrapped it with the same careful hands she had been thinking about for 3 weeks. When the wound was exposed, healed cleanly at the surface, the bruising beneath now an ugly yellow-green at the edges, his face did something contained and specific. She recognized it, after a moment. It was anger. Very controlled, very quiet, the kind of anger that had nowhere useful to go, and had been converted into something harder and more durable. "Who sent the assassin?" he said. The words were flat and certain, not a question. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know for certain," she said. "I have a strong hypothesis." "As do I." His hands had stilled against her side. His palms were warm, the heat of them bleeding through the thin linen of her tunic until she felt as though she were being seared by the contact. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, his large hands bracketing her waist, his thumbs resting just above her hips. The proximity was a physical weight, thick with the scent of wood smoke, cold iron, and the salt of his skin. "I should have told you sooner," he said, his voice dropping into a low, vibratory register that hummed against her skin. "There have been 2 attempts on the households of men Draven considered threats in the last 4 years. Neither was ever traced." "Ease careful," Morgan said, her own voice sounding thin to her ears. "Very." Jax's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. He was so close that her movement brought her chest almost against his arm. His eyes were dark, the amber edges catching the firelight, and the intensity in them was no longer just about the threat outside. It was a hunger, starved and sudden, that made her pulse hammer against her throat. "The plant in the food stores," she said, trying to anchor herself in data. "The one I found the 3rd morning. That was the 2nd attempt. The first was the knife." His hands, still resting at her side, pressed very slightly inward, not hurting, the opposite of hurting. A slow, possessive drag of his palms that made her breath hitch. He wasn't just checking a wound, he was claiming the space around it. "I'm alive," she said. "You are," he said. And the way he said it felt like a vow. "And I found the plant," she said. "And I know what to look for now. And I'm not," she paused, finding it. "I'm not without resources." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he began rewrapping the binding with fresh linen. His hands worked with that same agonizing care, but tonight, every brush of his knuckles against her skin felt like a spark. He was slow, deliberate, as if he were memorizing the architecture of her ribs through the cloth. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he said. "The plant. The night you found it. Why did you wait?" "I told you. I needed to be certain." "You were already certain." She was quiet. "You were testing whether I would believe you," he said. Not accusatory. "Precise," she exhaled. "I was testing whether the information would be received or dismissed," she said. "I've given information to people who didn't want it before. I needed to know how you handled evidence before I gave you evidence." He finished the knot, but his hands didn't fall away. They remained for a moment at her back, pinning her in the small space between him and the table. "And?" he whispered. "You handled it correctly," she said. She turned fully to face him. They were close again in the firelight. They were always arriving at this, the proximity, the particular suspended moment of it, and something was different tonight. The 3 weeks were different. The dress and the totem ground and the candles, and the slow accretion of mornings and evenings, and the rationed pieces of himself he'd been giving her like a man paying out rope. He raised his hand and touched her jaw. Just that, the back of 2 fingers, a brief and deliberate contact. His eyes were fixed on her mouth now, and she felt the heat of his gaze like a physical touch. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was a raspy growl. "Next time I will," she said. His fingers traced the line of her jaw to her chin and stopped there, his thumb catching the curve of her lower lip. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't have to. The pull was already there, a gravitational force that made the air between them feel like it was about to combust. "You are the most confounding person I have ever encountered," he said. "I've been told I'm a lot to deal with," she said. "That's not what I said." "I know," she said. "I know what you said." He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, and the scent of him was everywhere, intoxicating and sharp. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, hear the heavy, staggered rhythm of his heart. He dropped his hand abruptly, the movement jerky. "Sleep," he said. His voice had roughened into something unrecognizable. "You keep telling me to sleep," she said, her own voice caught in her throat. "I keep thinking you mean something else." The silence that followed was very long and very loud. His jaw worked. His eyes were doing the warm, dark thing in the firelight, and he was looking at her with an expression that had finally given up pretending to be something other than what it was. Want, plain and complicated, threaded through with the specific restraint of a man who had decided the wanting was not the same as the taking, and lived in the discipline of the distance between them. "Morgan," he said, her name like a warning and a question at the same time. "Jax," she said the same way. He made a sound low in his chest, something that conceded a point without words, and then he turned away. She watched the deliberate geometry of it, the choosing to turn, and understood it for what it was, not rejection, not indifference. The opposite of those, something that was protecting them both from a step taken before the ground was solid. She respected it. She hated it. She lay down on the pallet and stared at the ceiling and was very honest with herself, in the dark, about the state of her own wanting. It had been building for 3 weeks. It had the particular quality of things that built slowly, more structural than sharp, more pervasive than specific. She was drawn to his mind before his body, which was saying something given the body. The way he thought, tactical, honest, stripped of performance. The way he absorbed information, without ego. Updating without defensiveness. The 8-year-old stood before a totem and named in a warrior's lineage by a father who loved him. And the 14 months of being quietly, methodically stripped of everything that naming had meant, and still, showing up. Still holding the post. Still refusing to move to a smaller version of himself, just because the tribe had decided the smaller version was all he warranted. She knew something about that. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. She found the second plant on a Tuesday, or what she had decided to call Tuesday, because her mind needed a structure it recognized. It was in the water vessel, the large one, the communal one near the entrance that collected rainwater through a clay pipe from the roof. Not their primary drinking water, but the washing water, the water used for the soap making. The water anyone entering the dwelling might reasonably touch and transfer. It was a different compound this time, not the slow-acting digestive poison of the first attempt. This one she identified by smell, a sharp sweetness beneath the mineral water smell, faint enough to miss if you weren't already looking for it. She knew it because she had sorted the herbs 3 weeks ago, and this had been in the collection, a small dried bundle she'd set aside as potentially toxic pending further identification. It was contact acting. Skin absorption over repeated exposure. Slow enough to look like illness. Clever, she thought, with the cold appreciation of someone who had just found an elegant mechanism in an unacceptable experiment. She poured the vessel out herself, quietly, replaced the water from the secondary source, and sat down at the table with her flat stone and coal and began writing. Not calculations this time. Evidence. She had been building it for 3 weeks without fully deciding she was doing so. The small observations, the pattern of incidents, the council meeting attended by an elder who had also been present at the patrol rotation change 14 months ago, the intermediary she had identified through the soap network who had been to Draven's household twice in the past week. She had been assembling it the way she assembled a chemical analysis. Each piece insufficient alone, together they described a structure. She was still writing when Jax came in. He saw her face before he saw the flat stone. "What happened?" he said, not a question. She showed him the emptied vessel. She showed him the flat stone. She walked him through the evidence. All of it. This time, everything she had. Held back nothing. Laid it out in the clean sequential logic of someone who had been building toward this moment and was ready for it. He listened. He didn't interrupt. His face went through several things. Controlled anger, the cold, bright focus of tactical recognition, something that arrived last and stayed longest, which was the expression of a man recalibrating what it meant to have someone on his side. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You've been collecting this," he said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the first morning." He looked at the flat stone, at the careful notation she'd developed, her own hybrid language, chemical shorthand mixed with the Vorrkai script she'd been learning. Evidence that was also, in its form, evidence of her, of what she was, of the mind she was working with, of the strange and specific intelligence that had woken up in this body and decided to make it work. "Jax," she said. He looked up. "He's going to move against you at the council," she said. "The Border Patrol reassignment. It's not about removing you from the encampment. It's about demonstrating that the elders will follow his direction over clan loyalty. If they approve it, he has precedent. If he has precedent, he can propose anything, Jack said very quietly. Yes. He was silent for a moment. Then he stood, and the standing had a quality she recognized, the specific physical grammar of a man who had found his ground and was orienting himself to it. Not reckless, precise. The warrior she had been told he was, arriving in the space where the tactician had been. He looked at her. I need to speak with Corvin, he said. And with the elder Maret. Maret's wife uses my salve, Morgan said. She thinks well of this household. Something crossed his face. The almost smile, arriving with less resistance now than it had 3 weeks ago. Closer to the surface. Of course she does, he said, with a dryness she had come to recognize as his version of warmth. He picked up his cloak. He stopped at the door. Morgan. She looked up from the flat stone. He turned fully, which he didn't always do. Usually he angled, the fraction turn of a man who parceled out directness. He turned fully now, and looked at her across the dwelling, with the fire between them, and the candles she had made steady in their holders, and the evidence she had built, spread on the table between them. The man I was before, he said slowly, choosing each word with the precision of someone disarming something while explaining the mechanism, did not have anyone who built alongside him. My father did, when he was alive. No one since. A pause. I don't know what to do with that. She held his gaze. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. Just don't build walls in front of it. He was quiet. Then he gave a single, short nod, the nod of a man accepting terms he hadn't expected to be reasonable. He left. She sat in the dwelling he had made warmer with a dress laid at the foot of a pallet, and she pressed her palm flat on the flat stone covered in her own evidence, and she felt not safe. She had never felt safe. Not really. Not in 23 years of solving her own problems in rooms that hadn't wanted her. But something adjacent to it. Something that had the structure of safety without the naivete. Something that felt like we. She pulled the flat stone closer and kept writing. Outside, she heard his footsteps. Uneven, deliberate, unhurried, crossing the encampment toward Corvin's dwelling, and she tracked them until they faded, and she did not examine too closely what it meant that she could identify his particular gait by sound alone among all the other sounds of the Vorrkai at night. She kept writing. The candle burned steady and did not waver. Chapter 5. The Totem Stands. The council meeting was called for the morning of the 4th day. Morgan knew before the elder's messenger arrived at their door. She had been tracking the signals for 2 days, the specific pattern of Draven's movements through the encampment, the quiet consultations between his senior men at the outer fire pits, the way certain council members had begun avoiding eye contact with Jax during the communal morning gathering. She had mapped it the way she mapped chemical reactions, identify the reagents, predict the product, prepare for the heat. She had been preparing. Jax had spent the 2 days before the council moving through the encampment with the controlled purposefulness of a man who had found his ground and was laying claim to it quietly, without announcement. He met with Corvin twice. He spent an evening at the dwelling of the elder Maret, whose wife pressed his hand when he arrived and offered him her best clay cup, which was a significant gesture, and which Jax received with a grave courtesy that made the old woman's eyes warm. He spoke at length with 2 younger warriors, men who had served under his eastern border command before the injury, who still carried themselves with the particular bearing of soldiers who had not yet transferred their loyalty and were waiting to see if there was somewhere worth transferring it to. He told Morgan everything he did. Not all at once, not in formal reports. In the small increments of a man unlearning the habit of solitude, piece by piece, the way you removed a splint from a healed bone. An update in the evening. A name over the morning meal. A detail offered while he was checking his weapons, not looking at her. The words coming sideways like something he hadn't fully decided to say until it was already said. She received all of it with steadiness. Gave back what she had. Kept building. The night before the council she lay awake long after the candle had burned low, running through variables, finding the gaps, filling them with what she had. Jax was awake too. She could tell by his breathing, the specific quality of alertness in a still body, the subtle tension that came off him like heat from the cooling fire. Stop thinking so loudly, he said, from his side of the room. I'm not making any noise, she said. You don't have to, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Are you ready for tomorrow? A pause. I've been ready for 14 months, he said. I've been waiting for the ground to be solid enough to stand on. She thought of the soap and the candles, and Sarah and Muret's wife and Corvin's haunch of dark-meated game, all the small, unglamorous infrastructure she'd been laying down like foundations. It's solid, she said. Another pause. Longer. Then, yes, he said. It is. She closed her eyes. The fire breathed its slow breath. Outside, the Vorrkai encampment settled into its night sounds, and somewhere above them both the alien sky was doing its violet gold thing. Indifferent, and enormous. "Morgan," he said. "Yes. Whatever happens tomorrow," he stopped. Began again. "Whatever happens, this household stands." She felt it land in her chest, the specific weight of it. Not a promise of victory, a promise of us, of the ground between them regardless of the ground outside it. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent her whole short life with no one to call a constant, exactly what it cost him to say it. "I know," she said. "Get some sleep." He exhaled, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding. "You too." She smiled at the ceiling in the dark. "I'll try." The council met in the Elder Hall, which was the largest structure in the encampment, stone-built like the dwellings but broader, with a high ceiling and a central fire pit long enough for 20 people to sit around comfortably. The carved totem figures continued here, worked into the walls themselves, the ancestors watching from every surface with their interlocking geometric eyes. Morgan was not supposed to be there. The council was for warriors, elders, and the chief. Wives attended public ceremonies and communal fires, and occupied the social spaces that had been designated for them across generations of Vorrkai custom, and the council hall was not among them. She came anyway, not visibly. She found a position at the outer edge of the hall's entrance, technically outside, technically observing from the public threshold, which was not prohibited by any custom she had been able to determine. And she stood there in her good green dress with her gold hair braided back, and her hands folded in front of her, and she watched. She had also, in the 2 days prior, had 4 separate conversations with 4 separate women, whose husbands sat on the Elder Council. She had not asked for anything directly. She had shared information about the household, about Jax's Eastern Border record, about the patrol rotation the night of the injury, presented not as accusation, but as context, as the kind of detail a wife shared with another wife over the soap trade, because she thought it was interesting. She had also distributed the last 6 blocks of a particularly good lavender-adjacent soap batch, and had left the salve for Moret's wife with a freshly written instruction set on how to prepare the next application herself. Small threads. She had spent 3 weeks building the loom. Draven opened the council with the particular grace of a man who believed he had already won. He presented the Border Patrol reassignment with the same layered courtesy he used on everything, framed as honoring Jax's warrior legacy, as acknowledging the difficulty of his current physical limitations, as the council's collective obligation to ensure the encampment's outer defenses were properly maintained. He said Jax's name with the specific warmth of a man publicly loving his brother while privately gutting him. Morgan watched Jax across the hall. He was seated at the council fire, spine straight, both feet on the ground, the limp invisible in stillness. His face was its carved, unreadable self, the totem face, she had started calling it in her mind, the face he wore when he was taking in more than he was giving out. His dark eyes moved around the council as Draven spoke, tracking, measuring. When Draven finished, Jax spoke. She had not heard him address a formal assembly before. She had heard him in the dwelling, low, rationed, precise. She had heard him outside with Corvin and the younger warriors, direct, technical, the shorthand of men who shared a professional language. She had not heard him here. His voice in the council hall was different. Not louder, deeper, the specific resonance of a voice that had found the room it was built for, that fit the stone and the fire and the watching ancestor eyes the way a key fit a lock it had been cut for. He did not address Draven's proposal directly. He told a story, the night of the attack on the eastern border, 14 months ago. He told it without drama, without self-pity, with the clean sequential precision of a field report. What the patrol rotation had been, how it had been changed the day before the attack, and by whose administrative order, where each man had been positioned when the attack came, how long he had held the wall alone before support arrived. He named every man who had been present. He named every man who had been absent from their assigned position. He did not say, Draven arranged this. He presented facts. He let the council hear the shape of them. The silence after was a different quality of silence than the one after Draven had spoken. Draven's silence had been the comfortable silence of a foregone conclusion. This was the silence of people doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to have to do, and arriving at a sum that made them uncomfortable. Elder Merritt spoke first. He was very old and very deliberate, and he asked, in the slow way of a man who already knows the answer and is asking for the record, who had authorized the rotation change. Draven's expression did not change. He was too skilled for that, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation, the look of a man who had walked into a room expecting empty ground and found it occupied. He cited a former administrative officer. The man, conveniently, had died in the winter. A second elder, the husband of the woman who had been the first to ask Sarah about the soap, which Morgan knew because Sarah had told her, raised the question of whether the Eastern Border's current patrol strength was adequate, and whether the warrior who had designed and maintained that system for 3 years might have useful insight into its current deficiencies. A third elder, unprompted, mentioned that Jax's household had demonstrated considerable resourcefulness and community contribution in recent weeks, and that the encampment's well-being was served by stable, productive households. Morgan, at the threshold, did not allow herself to smile. She kept her face composed and her hands folded, and she breathed steadily, and she thought, infrastructure. It's always infrastructure. Draven proposed the border reassignment to a formal vote. He received 6 votes. He needed 10. Jax found her at the threshold when the council filed out. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with his totem face, and then the totem face did something. It shifted, cracked at the edges, the controlled severity of it, giving way to something that was not quite an expression she had a name for yet, because she had not seen it fully on him before. Raw, present. A man standing in the open without his armor, meeting her eyes across the space where his armor had been. The elder Merritt, he said. He's a fair man, Morgan said. He responds to evidence. His wife has excellent joints, Morgan said. The salve works well on that particular presentation. Jax looked at her for a long moment. The soap, he said. People underestimate soap, she said. They shouldn't. He exhaled. The sound she had been listening for across 4 chapters of this life they were building. The sound of a man releasing the last of something he'd been holding for 14 months. He raised his hand and cupped her face in his palm, and this was not the careful 2-finger trace on her jaw from the night of the wound dressing. This was deliberate, full contact. His thumb at her cheekbone and his fingers at her temple, and his dark eyes on hers, with nothing performing in them, nothing managed, just the looking. Come home, he said. It was the first time he had called it that. Home. She felt it move through her like a chemical reaction, the specific, irreversible kind, the kind where the reagents changed form and could not change back. Yes, she said. Let's go home. The dwelling was warm. She had banked the fire that morning before the council, and it had held. The coals still breathing orange-red, and the candles were unlit but ready, and the space had the particular quality it had developed over 4 weeks of her attention. Ordered, functional, and something more than those. Something that came from the accumulation of choices made toward a place rather than just within it. Jax closed the door. The sound of the latch was very loud in the quiet. Morgan turned to face him and found him already looking at her. Had been looking at her, she understood, for the entire walk back from the council hall. The entire time she had been facing away from him and feeling the looking on her back like a hand. Morgan, he said, and her name in his mouth was different again. Not logistics, not the warning question of the night before the council. Something that had given up its pretexts. Yes, she said, before he could say anything else. An answer to the question he hadn't asked yet. The question that had been building for 4 weeks in candlelight and close quarters and careful hands and rationed pieces of himself and the specific, sustained patience of 2 people who had been protecting themselves from the same step for different reasons and had arrived, together, at the place where protection was no longer the point. He crossed to her in 3 steps and his hands found her face again, and this time when he looked down at her, the distance closed. He kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything he did. Deliberate, precise, nothing performed, nothing wasted. His mouth on hers was careful at first, the careful of a man who had decided something and was following it completely. And then she kissed him back with equal precision, and the careful became something else. His hands moved from her face to her hair, fingers threading through the gold of it. She felt the sudden, searing heat of him as he pulled her closer, his large hands sliding down to the small of her back, pressing her body flush against the hard, unyielding lines of his own. The friction of the green dress against her skin and the weight of his palms created a current of pure electricity that made her pulse skip. She felt him breathe against her mouth, and felt the breath catch, felt the specific quality of a large and guarded man discovering that what he'd been managing for weeks was considerably more difficult to manage when the distance was gone. She pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were open. She'd wondered if they would be very dark, the amber warmth in them fully visible at this proximity. And he was looking at her with the same quality of attention he gave to everything she did, complete and undefended and real. Your ribs, he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down her spine, are fine, she said. The wound. Jax. She held his gaze. I know my own body. He exhaled. His forehead dropped to hers. A small contact, an intimate one, the kind that wasn't about desire and was about something that sat beneath it. He breathed with his forehead against hers, and she felt his hands at her back, steady and warm, the hands that had wrapped her wounds and laid out a green dress at the foot of a pallet and given her back her name, the way other people gave back borrowed things. I don't do anything halfway, he said low, almost to himself. Neither do I, she said. That's the problem. That's not a problem, he said. And then his mouth found hers again, and it was not the tentative first kiss anymore, it was the second one, the one that knew what it was doing and had decided to do it completely. His tongue traced the seam of her lips, a demand that she met with her own, the kiss deepening into something primal and heavy. He walked her back toward the pallet with the unhurried confidence of a man who had stopped managing his want and was now simply present in it. She went with him, not led, not passive, meeting him step for step the way she had been meeting him since the first morning when she'd eaten standing up and catalogued her own survival and decided to stay. He sat at the edge of the pallet and drew her down between his knees, and his hands moved to the lacing of the green dress. The same lacing his hands had learned the night of the wound dressing, the same knots, and he undid them now with a different quality of patience, deliberate and thorough, his eyes on her face the entire time, watching for the wince of the ribs, watching for something else too. Her, present, choosing, here, she was. She was choosing. She was more here than she had been anywhere in 23 years of her actual life, more located in a moment, more specifically and entirely present in her own skin. In this skin, this borrowed and now inhabited body that had been terrifying in the copper disc and was now simply hers. The body she moved through this world in. The body he was learning with his hands. As the dress pulled at her waist, his thumbs traced the soft skin just above the binding of her ribs, a slow, possessive drag that made her blood run hot. "You're thinking?" he said against her neck, his lips grazing the sensitive skin there until she had to grip his shoulders to stay steady. "I think constantly," she said. "You'll have to live with it." She felt him smile against her skin, a real one, the full motion of it, the first fully completed smile she had witnessed on that severe and careful face. And it undid something in her that had been wound tight since she'd woken up on a stranger's pallet, with a stranger's wound and a stranger's name for the world. What followed was not the frantic urgency of people who had been waiting too long. It was not desperate or performative or rushed. It had the quality of everything they had built together, methodical, thorough, genuine, nothing wasted. He learned her the way he learned anything she gave him, completely, without ego, updating and adjusting, his attention entirely on her in the specific way that felt less like being wanted and more like being known, and she understood finally why the distinction mattered. His touch was a revelation, the rough, calloused texture of his palms against the smoothness of her skin, the way he hovered over her as if she were the only constant in a shifting world. Every movement was an unspoken question, and every breath she took was the answer. She had been wanted before. Briefly, transactionally, in the way of people who saw a body, and not the mind inside it. This was not that. This was a man who had watched her make soap and outline evidence on a flat stone, and stand at the totem ground with her chin level, and talk back to a chief with a smile like a blade, and who wanted that, all of it, the mind first and the body as the home it lived in. She gave him everything she had, which was, it turned out, considerable. Afterward, she lay with her head on his chest, and listened to his heartbeat slow from its accelerated rate, back toward the steady, measured rhythm she had come to know as his resting state. Even in sleep she had learned it. 4 weeks of sleeping in the same room, calibrating her awareness to him without her permission. His hand moved slowly through her hair. Not speaking. She felt the deliberateness of the not speaking, the choosing to be quiet, to stay in the moment, to not return immediately to logistics. This was a man whose default was to fill silence with purpose, and he was choosing, consciously, to let the silence be what it was. She matched him. Let her own mind quiet. The fire breathed. The candles, one of them, he had lit one while she was braiding her hair back before the council, she had noticed and not commented on, threw its small, steady light across the ceiling. "The flat stone," he said eventually. His voice was different in this register. Lower, slower, the particular intimacy of a voice that isn't performing anything. "What about it? The notation you use, the symbols mixed with the Vorrkai script." His hand continued its slow movement through her hair. "You made that yourself." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about this. "I needed a language that held both of what I am," she said. "Where I came from, and where I am. I couldn't think clearly in one without the other." His hand stilled briefly, then continued. "Where you came from," he said. "You will tell me someday." "Someday," she agreed, not a deflection. A promise. When she had the language for it, when she understood it herself. The transmigration, the laptop, the ramen, the girl who had worked herself to death in a world of Bunsen burners and financial aid forms, she would find the words. She would give him that the way he had given her the 8-year-old at the totem, piece by piece, until the whole of it was between them. "Your mind," he said. "The way it works. What about it?" "I've never." He paused, and she recognized the pause, the selecting, the deliberate disarmament. "I've never had anyone think alongside me. My father did, when I was a child. He would bring me problems and listen to how I solved them. He said I had a particular kind of mind." His voice was very level, but it had the texture of something carefully maintained. "After he died, there was no one." She pressed her palm flat against his chest. Over his heartbeat. "I'm here," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." She felt him breathe, deep, full, the breath of someone who had been breathing carefully for a long time and had briefly stopped. "Draven will not accept today's outcome," he said. "No," she agreed. But today narrowed his options. The elders who voted against him will need to be managed. He'll move carefully now. He has less room than he did. He still has room. Then we keep building, she said. The soap network reaches 4 more households than it did last week. Corvin's hunting party talked to 2 border warriors yesterday. I heard it from Sarah. The ground is moving, Jax. Slowly, but it's moving. He was quiet for a moment. His hand had resumed its movement through her hair. "You said," he began, "the day I asked why you helped at the council. You said I was worth investing in." "Yes. I want to know." Another pause, longer, the most careful selecting she had heard from him. "I want to know if that has changed. Now that you are not simply, now that this is more complicated?" she offered. "More," he said simply. She understood him. He was asking, in the specific language of a man who did not ask for things easily, has the investment changed now that it is also a feeling? Has the ledger changed? Are you here because it is strategic, or because it is something else? She pushed herself up onto her elbow and looked down at him. His face in the candlelight was open in a way she had not seen it except for the brief unguarded moments. The almost smiles, the recalculations, the forehead against hers. Fully open now, the armor entirely set aside, a man asking a question he could not afford to perform indifference to the answer of. "I grew up alone," she said. "I worked alone. I survived alone for a long time, and I was good at it, and it cost me things. I didn't notice it was costing me until I ended up somewhere I never expected and found you." She held his gaze. The investment was strategic at first. It became real before I was paying attention. That's usually how things I care about arrive. A pause. "I care about this. I care about you." That's not a resource calculation. It's just true. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and pulled her back down against him, with the careful certainty of a man who had decided something fundamental and was done deliberating. "I am not a man who says things simply," he said, his voice low against her hair. "I know," she said. "Neither am I. But I want you to know, Jax." She pressed her hand to his chest again. "I know," and she did. She had been reading him for 4 weeks in the specific way that mattered. Not his words, which came rationed and precise, but the dress at the foot of the pallet and the candle left burning, and the hands that were careful, and the forehead against hers before the council. She had been reading all of it, and she knew. He exhaled, long and slow, and his arms settled around her with the quality of something that had stopped being temporary. Outside, the Vorrkai encampment moved through its evening. Fires banked, children gathered, the distant ring of the elder bell that marked the night watch. Ordinary and enormous, and nothing she had been prepared for, and exactly where she was. She thought, briefly, of a laptop screen and a cursor blinking in the dark. Of a girl bent over a lab report at 2 a.m, with cold ramen and $40, and a gap between her front teeth and a life held together with the specific fierce competence of someone who had never had another option. She had worked herself to death, that girl, had given everything to a world that gave very little back, and then she had woken up here, in this body, in this stone dwelling, in this alien sky world with its red-trumped trees and its violet gold dawns, with a man who laid dresses at the foot of her pallet and learned her wounds, and gave her his evidence and his father's memory and his first real smile, and said home like it was a word he had been saving. She was a chemistry senior, who had transmigrated into a barbarian fantasy world, and made soap, and built a political network, and consummated a marriage in candlelight with a disgraced warrior who carried himself like the world owed him nothing, and asked for nothing, and was, underneath all the armor, the most genuine person she had ever been given access to. She had always been good at making things from available materials. This, she thought, was going to be the finest thing she'd ever made. She closed her eyes. The candle burned, the fire breathed, and Morgan Reyes, chemist, survivor, builder of foundations, unlikely wife of the man who was and would be and had always been worth the investment, let herself, at long last, simply rest. End of